Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Valiant Voices series. We're just bringing in all the participants, so thank you for coming. We'll get started in just a minute. Okay, well, I see it is a little bit afternoon, so I think we will go ahead and begin with our Valiant Voices series. My name is Cheryl Thomas, and I am the Executive Director of Global Rights for Women here in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and welcome. We're just thrilled you can join us for what I think is going to be a very powerful and poignant conversation today. We'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. We gratefully acknowledge the Indigenous people of the lands we are on today. Even though we are meeting in a virtual space, it's important for us to recognize that we have and continue to benefit from the theft and occupation of this land since before the United States was formed as a nation. Global Rights for Women is located in Minneapolis, Minnesota, with staff throughout Minnesota, and acknowledges that we are on Dakota and Anishinaabe land. We recognize the historic discrimination and violence that have been inflicted on Indigenous people globally. Additionally, we understand the treatment of Indigenous women is a byproduct of colonialism, racism, and misogyny that has perpetuated the continued sexual abuse, disappearance, and murder of Indigenous women here in Minnesota and in many places around the world. So please now join us in a moment of reflection to acknowledge that harm of the past and present, and consider how you can join in the effort to dismantle the continued oppression of Indigenous communities and restore justice. And also, since people are joining us here from around the world, at this time, if you'd like to put into the chat the land that you are acknowledging, we would much appreciate that. So I am going to begin by introducing the two women that you see here. We're just so thrilled to have you both, Cami and Lori. Cami Inforzato came to the domestic abuse intervention programs up in Duluth, Minnesota, seeking help for her and her children in 2002 from an abusive husband. Cami utilized DAIP's advocacy and visitation center services, and soon after started to volunteer and give back to the programs that helped her. Part of Cami's volunteer work was to participate in focus groups and analysis of the post-separation wheel developed with women using the visitation center. In 2019, Cami took a position at DAIP as an advocate and currently works with victims who have criminal, child protective services, and protective order cases. Cami also facilitates the Turning Points program for abused women who are convicted of domestic assault. Cami has done local and national trainings on women's experience of intimate partner violence, witness intimidation in the courthouse, and how the different impacts on the power and control wheel affect victims. Cami also has a degree in human services from the University of Wisconsin, and she's been part of the women's movement since 2002. Welcome, Cami, and thank you so much for joining us and telling us your story and giving us information. Thank you. And I'm also just delighted to introduce my colleague, Lori Flohaug, who was born and raised in northern Minnesota in a small town known for outdoor recreation, mining, and timber logging. Growing up in a family of 8 children in a home ridden with extreme domestic violence, sexual violence, addiction, poverty, and mental illness, Ms. Flohaug focused her work on her own set of coping skills with an eye on creating a better life for herself and helping others. Lori is enrolled as a tribal member of the Turtle Mountain Band of Ojibwe Indians. She is the first in her family to graduate from college and is the only family member to attend law school after she was married and had a small child. Lori has dedicated her 25-year legal career to helping others in crisis and focusing on women and children. Lori has worked as a domestic violence advocate, a guardian ad litem, a legal aid attorney, state prosecutor, state public defender, and as a tribal judge for presiding over child protection cases for the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe Indian Reservation. So many different angles on this issue that Lori brings to us. She's served on numerous boards and committees, and in her free time, Lori enjoys photography, painting, sewing, gardening, and watching her children participate in numerous sports and activities. During her quarantine during the COVID pandemic, Lori focused her creative energy to teach herself how to bake and decorate sugar cookies. And we get to see those at some of the art of these two amazing women after our conversation. So I just quickly want to say something about the series here. Valiant Voices is a conversation series created by Global Rights for Women that features human rights advocates and survivors addressing injustice and disrupting oppressive systems that cause harm. So these are the stories of those powerful leaders creating change in their own communities and around the world. We are live streaming on Facebook today and welcome your comments there, or please in the chat on Zoom, and we will take questions. We'll leave time for questions. And after the recording, after the conversation, we'll send out a recording. And additionally, a really interesting part of today's conversation, the recording and conversation will be shared by the Collectif Génération Féministe in Paris, France. And we are in solidarity with their campaign, wonderful campaign, Stop Talking, Start Funding, to pressure world leaders to fund efforts to end violence against women and girls. We're so grateful for them, including us in their global campaign, as well as their optimism and persistence in raising awareness about this devastating human rights crisis. So let's get started. Cami, I'd like to start with you with our first question. So women experiencing violence hear a lot of social messages from a variety of people, including family, friends, co-workers, and many times women are told things like, if he's so terrible, you should just leave, or conversely, you made your own bed, you should just lie in it. Having survived an abusive relationship, Cami, what do you think about these messages? If people really want to be helpful or advocate for women experiencing violence, what might be a better approach? We talk about that for a minute, Cami?
Sure. Women hearing those statements, the one, you made your bed, you can lie in it, which I heard that, it can be very blaming and confusing because that's what she's experiencing, obviously, with her partner, is the blame and the confusion. And how can she get beyond that when that's what she's hearing? And then the opposite side of that is just get out. How do you just get out when there might be shelters, there might not be shelters, there's barriers such as financial, family, she can't necessarily maybe utilize family because sometimes she comes from a situation where there's domestic violence. Friends, that that can vary in potential for support also. Sometimes some women have super support where they're able to document and help her out of a situation. In my situation, my mom was a little on both sides of the situation, where it was, you married him and you need to stay with him. And then by the same token, she would also say she couldn't stand to see what was happening to me and she wanted to see me get out. And so she would supply me with information on the sly so that he didn't know that I was getting it. She would drop by information at work for me that was useful, because I actually initially did not even identify that what he was doing was abusive. I knew it was hurtful and harmful, being slapped in public, and he was a police officer. I knew it was hurtful and wrong, but to me, that was what I thought was a part of our marriage.
So that the issue of him being a police officer is something that we hear a lot in our work all over the world, Cami. We hear stories from many women who are being abused by their husbands who are police officers. And can you talk just a little bit more about that dynamic and how difficult how that complicates and makes it particularly dangerous for you?
Sure. I did not get relief from his violence until he died. He, for many years went by where he was continually oppressive, using the system, and he had me in and out of court, which was scary. At one point, he would go into the courtroom wearing his uniform, which impacted how I was able to perform in the courtroom. I could not be my authentic self. I could not express what he was doing to me in front of the professionals that were involved in my life at that time. Because a lot of his abuse revolved around him being a police officer. It revolved around the uniform, and seeing that in court was a way, well, it was traumatic for me, but him doing it was a way to manipulate the situation and manipulate the people in the courtroom. And he'd walk in with his gun on. He had all the power. Everything was centralized around him. I could not articulate what was happening to me in a way that would benefit me and my children. And most importantly, I couldn't get across how to keep us safe. On the opposite side of that, I'm just going to put out there, I had actually been married to another abuser. The situation changed completely because the court had been set up so that there was no courtroom intimidation. The system is being worked on so that it's changing for women. The only thing that I got to see with him was the cuff of his shirt. And that was it, because I was so protected by advocates and courtroom security. And so the impact and the level of trauma didn't stay with me, and I was able to function much better and get what I needed out of that situation.
Well, that is just such a wonderful example of when the system, in particular the legal system that's supposed to be there for you, providing remedies and protection, is intentionally making an effort to make it safe and comfortable for you versus your experience before. What a lesson for legal systems and communities around the world to understand that impact. Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Yeah. So Lori, for you now as a family attorney, you're practicing now. I know you see women coming to you with a lot of challenges, especially around the question of leaving an abusive relationship. And the response from the system can also be challenging, like Cami has described, this horrific situation with her abuser was a police officer. And especially when the abuse is minimized or ignored, as it so often is, I think, everywhere throughout the world. We know that women have no representation, who have no representation are essentially divested of their rights too often. They just can't come up against that kind of team that's opposed to them. So who are the people most at risk for that kind of dynamic? And what are the things you can do as an attorney to advocate for women? And then what do you think needs to change on behalf of survivors?
Right. So to just follow up with some of the scenarios that Cami set forth, when you have women who have been in longstanding relationships where domestic violence is at its core, that disenfranchisement that happens results in a lack of resources and a lack of support. I've had many clients who, don't have a driver's license, don't have access to money, don't have their name on accounts. And so it's really important as a family law attorney, when I have a victim of domestic violence come into my office and ask for my services, first and foremost, believe her. It's really important to acknowledge the lived experiences of women and to believe her, and then not cast that judgment on, well, what do we need for you to do to leave, because you just need to leave. Acknowledging that if they share a residence, if they share children, it may be very difficult for her to leave. And you need to respect the victim, understanding him more than anybody else. She knows what she needs to be safe. She knows when lethality may be at its high point. And we know statistically that lethality is at its highest point when she is getting ready to leave. And so first and foremost, as an attorney, to acknowledge that and work with that.
Well, can you just talk a little bit about why that is? Why is it so dangerous when women leave? Is it about the power challenging that?
It is, because what we know statistically about domestic violence is that it's not a relationship issue. It is historically based upon an inequality of power and control within the relationship. And so as long as the victim of domestic violence, typically the woman, as long as the woman is doing what she's supposed to be doing, listening and following his instruction and direction, he's going to go on his merry way, going to work, having his friends, doing what he wants to do, because he has her where he wants her to be. Right. The second that she challenges him on that, he needs to assert more power, more control, increase the dangerousness, increase the violence in order to maintain that same level of control that maybe he had with just walking into a courtroom with his uniform on.
Right.
And so we know statistically that is an extremely dangerous time for women. And as a family law attorney, you need to know that. Mm-hmm. You need to acknowledge that. You need to trust your client in knowing what she needs and when she needs it, being supportive of her, and then connecting her with other service providers who also have that shared understanding. And so that's really something that I know that within the work around the world that Global Rights for Women does, is working to promote that shared understanding. Because if the attorney understands the dynamic of domestic violence, but perhaps a social worker doesn't, maybe they believe that it's a relationship and she needs to work on certain things to build up the relationship, or if the judge thinks that it's a communication issue, that we just need them to attend therapy together or promote mediation to try to work out these issues. If there is not that shared understanding, what we know is that the batterer, the offender, will continue to manipulate and use those gaps to his advantage.
Yeah.
We know that.
Yeah, that's really important. This shared understanding is something that, as you know, Lori has traveled and trained with us, is just so very important, because when you come from that shared understanding, you can intervene in a way that is truly going to meet the victim's needs, rather than promote your own agenda. Perhaps it's family unification or something like that. So yeah, it's so important to listen to the voices of women. Cami, did you have a comment you wanted to share with us on that?
Yeah, I was just thinking that it's so important for the system to be organized to meet her needs. I think, like Lori was saying, because it helps her to have the ability to act in her own best interest, which she hasn't been able to do before because she has been powerless. When the system confronts him and leverages something against him, he's held accountable, and that diminishes the amount of power that he has over her. And that helps her to have the space to be able to think and be healthy and act on her own, so that, you know, she can feel that sense of oppression leaving her.
Right. Right. Yes, I think that's so important, Lori and Cami, because we often hear, you know, the most effective legal system professionals that we know, and I've worked with, police, they can be police, prosecutors, judges, whoever, probation, they understand that this historic power imbalance between men and women that we know and the United Nations has identified as the core cause of domestic violence is this power imbalance. And when the legal system can interrupt that power imbalance and they understand their role in doing that, they can be much more effective. So yeah, thank you for that.
Yes, and to just to talk a little bit more about that, when you are working in a community that has that shared understanding and has developed that coordinated community response, now you have law enforcement that has implemented and developed certain policies, certain practices, certain protocols, and then how that transitions to how prosecution would work with that shared understanding and that collaboration with the information as received from law enforcement. And then the case moves on to the court system, and then even beyond that to probation services that will continue to hold the offender accountable, to men's intervention programs that will continue to hold the offender accountable. Now you have, as Cami has indicated, you know, now you have that relief that the victim feels to have power over her own life, her own experience, the lives and experiences of her children, when you have that offender being held accountable for his battering behavior, and the responsibility is not on the one who has no power.
Right, right. And she's not alone anymore. She has this, if she's feeling that, that's transformational, or can be. Yes, I'm just taking a look at the chat here. Okay.
I was just going to pop in real quick unless there was a question. Sometimes also when the system isn't functioning in a way that is cohesive, because it can still happen, to her, what it looks like is a replication of the abuse, the power, the control, and she might give up and give over, and that isn't beneficial for her or her children, and it doesn't keep her safe. It ends up bringing her to a place where, I've used this term with batterers, and now I'm kind of seeing it in like certain system situations where it's called camouflage. So it impacts her both mentally and physically in her health, because she's consistently jumping to meet his demands or the demands of the system. And so she's changing how her behavior comes across, and not just comes across, but how she is going to keep safe. And sometimes she has to do that even with the system. So it's really important for them to be cohesive in the way that they respond to her.
Right. We're getting some just excellent questions in the chat, and we're going to come to those. Thank you, Diane and Roberta, for those great questions. We'll come back to those. I want to ask you both. You're both passionate advocates now for women experiencing violence in your own spheres of influence. Your voices with you telling your own experiences are about as powerful and inspiration for change, I think, everywhere in the world when people really hear the stories of victims which have been silenced for so long. It can inspire transformational thinking and change. What would be your wildest dream come true for the work that you do, and how can others start to work in their own spheres of influence to make a difference and enact the changes we've talked about? You want to go first, Lori?
Well, I think it comes back to, first of all, when victims' experiences are believed.
Oh,
If we work with that assumption that we are going to believe this individual who has risked so much in just disclosing what we would like to think, in many societies, it would like to think is a family issue. When we acknowledge and understand that this is a crime against society, it is a violation of her human rights. When we start there and as a community, acknowledge and come together that we're not going to tolerate this behavior in our community, then it makes that work so much easier when you're trying to coordinate that community response, when you're trying to have those conversations between law enforcement, between probation. You're always going to do that in conjunction with, how does this impact women, and how does this make women's lives more safe?
right. That believing women is, if we could just do that in our world about sexual assault and domestic violence, to believe them. And that's not necessary to say throw someone in jail. When a woman says something, there always has to be due process, of course. But as John Choi, our Ramsey County attorney, says, and he started a campaign here in Minnesota that's entitled "Start by Believing." And just that will be such a change for women in their telling their stories about violence, because that has not been the situation worldwide traditionally. So Cami, do you want to answer that question too then? We'd love to hear your response.
I think that belief is absolutely at the top, being believed, because otherwise she's been so undermined and by her abuser and told that she's crazy. She needs that support to uplift her. And then to go hand in hand with that is to not judge. That judgment piece of why did you stay for 7 years? How could you take it that long? Why did you decide to do that? And it's her path, it's her reasoning, and it's about her safety and when and if she can get out, and what's in place to help her be safe. And if those things are not clicking, if they're not there, it makes it so hard for her to get out. People talk about, the simplest things, the basic needs like housing, food, clothing, and shelter. And those are all very important. But, there are women who maybe don't have like children, and it comes down to, I don't want to leave because he's going to kill my rabbits. Or I don't want to leave because of what he's going to do to my, my whatever pet. It's a little bit bigger than just those basic needs. I mean, absolutely they're important, but there's so much more to a woman getting the start on that path to healing and to safety. And to some people, some of those things are, something that could be poo-pooed, but they are what has meant a lot to her to keep her mentally healthy, to keep her safe, having the rabbit, having the dog, having, you know, those things too. Like where can she go to be safe with those things? You know, her animals, or, you know, food that she needs. Like sometimes it's an allergy piece for her kids, or it's a lot. And people judge, and women don't always feel safe to come forward when they've been judged immediately with, why don't you leave?
Right. Why would they? I mean, I think in some ways it's up to us as the community and the legal system to make a safe environment rather than judge and shame. There's so many good reasons why women wouldn't come forward and report. So yes, thank you for that. And I see Pat now. We have some questions in the chat. So some really good questions in the chat. I'd love to hear those, Pat. Thank you.
Yeah.
Is our Director of Communications at Global Rights for Women, and Valiant Voices is her vision and her idea, and she's been monitoring the chat for some questions.
Thank you. So we have a great question from Roberta. Any advice on setting up these collaborative relationships with law enforcement, legal, etc.? Familiar with SARTs? Is there a similar program for domestic violence?
Sorry, teams, sexual assault response teams. Okay. I'm assuming that's what she means. Yeah, and okay. Lori, you've been both of you have been so deeply involved in that. Take it away. Yeah, Lori, start with
Yes, and so when I was a prosecutor in my jurisdiction in northern Minnesota, we developed that coordinated community response program within our community, and I can tell you it was a rocky road, because when everybody, whether it's individually or as an organization, has their own belief as to what the problem is, if they believe it's a communication problem or if they believe that it's a relationship problem, and then you put them all into a room at the same time, you know, everybody has this idea of how to fix it. You know, your belief system impacts the process for change. Yeah. And so, you know, again, it all begins with bringing those stakeholders into an environment where they have the ability to learn, as to what the real cause of domestic violence is. And it's only when you have that shared understanding, and we continue to say that so often, but once everybody is on the same page as to what the problem is, then it really makes that ability to come up with policy, procedure, practice, collaboration, information sharing, all of those things become easier. And we know that if you don't have those in place, every opportunity to manipulate the system, coerce, and use the system against the victim, we know that the batterer is going to jump on that opportunity. And so it just really starts with getting the people in the room.
And listening to the victims talk about why.
Absolutely, because what works in one community is not going to work in another community. And so, for example, you know, within the Native American population that is in northern Minnesota, you know, the response within that community is going to be different than perhaps maybe in a really urban area, and different, you know, because you just have different circumstances within the particular community as well. And so you have to listen to the victims in that community. What is their experience when they interact with law enforcement, when they interact with legal aid services or NGOs or social services? Listen to them.
Exactly. Did you want to add anything to that, Cami?
No, she covered that pretty well.
Quickly stated.
No, she did a good job. Yeah. I guess the only other thing that I was thinking of that we didn't touch on is like the women who go through my group who are court ordered, they have said that one of the best things that has helped them, in addition to being believed, because that's what's happening when we're talking, you know, we'll go through the process of the curriculum, but they say, you know, you believe what I'm saying, and that's like a first for them. Like, they tell me nobody has heard me out before, you know, and this is really important to them. It helps them to think better. It helps them to think beyond the trauma, and that's really important in keeping them safe. It's thinking beyond the trauma. And then also, the one thing, because I did talk to 4 of the women who are now completed with one of my groups last night, I said, what can you tell me that, you know, I can bring to the group for today? And they said, well, one of the biggest things is having that continued connection, that access, that because they have access to me after group. I wasn't just a part of the system for them. So they need to reach me when they're in that moment of trauma, like 8 o'clock at night or whenever it might happen, that they have immediate access to someone who sounds safe, that it isn't just a voice saying that sounds really dangerous. It's someone who has experienced this with them when they're explaining their trauma. So it reduces the trauma. They're not waiting until 9 o'clock tomorrow morning or 10 o'clock when they can talk to someone to process everything. It's that continued support, and they need that. And they, like one woman last night, she said, I was really afraid of this guy that I was dating. She says, and I thought about how people had told me to watch for red flags. And for her, part of our conversation was, don't wait for the red flags. If you're waiting for red flags, it's too late. For her, it's too late. So she needed to hear that again. And so she called, you know, when we were talking about it last night, that's what she brought up. It was something that stuck with her because she was afraid he was going to punch her in the car. And she said, I'm not waiting for red flags. So
Yeah.
it was that continued believing and no judgment.
Oh boy, is that a huge one. Thank you for that, Cami. And you know, there's another really interesting question in the chat here, and challenging question. Diane Bray says, collaboration can be a woman's worst nightmare if the perpetrator is in law enforcement. And you are both nodding your head. Let's start with you, Lori.
Yeah, for me, it didn't stop. There had been a law that had been really important for me passed that ended up being more of like a collateral damage type thing in my case. I won't talk about it too much because it would take up too much time, but he used things, he looked for things that were progress for women to use against me. And he knew those laws because he was in, or he knew how to use these things because he was in law enforcement. He knew how to, at that time, before certain things were in place in the community for helping women, he knew how to walk into the courtroom and intimidate. He knew how to use that uniform. He knew how to use the gun. In the courtroom for me, one of the ways that he intimidated me was by tapping his foot. And I would tell people, look what he's doing, that's meant for me. And they'd say, no, he just has a nervous twitch. He knew how to use so many things and down so many avenues in order to do what abusers do, which is to win, to have that power. And he leveraged that power every way that he could.
So it's really, again, a matter of legal professionals being aware of these signals that are being sent, and not and being those that hold this person accountable. And Lori, I saw you nodding your head too. Accountability within the system is holding each other accountable is huge in making these laws work for women. Yeah.
Absolutely. And so when you start with a focus group of victims who are in the system, and then you first listen to, you know, your husband or your boyfriend is in law enforcement or was in law enforcement, what was your experience? what was used against you. And so you start there, and then you can develop policies and practices where if there is a call to law enforcement and the perpetrator is a member of law enforcement, now you have a policy that is followed so that there is a different investigation team and some oversight that happens so that that particular offender cannot use the system as one other way to control and batter.
But those are such insightful comments. Just naming a problem that is so pervasive. Yeah. Thank you both. Oh my goodness. Thank you both so much. And I'd like to thank all of our participants for being here today. I think it's time to wrap up, isn't it, Pat? Have I got that?
Yeah, I am looking forward to sharing some of the photos of Lori and Cami's lovely artistry. So let's look at these beautiful photos. This is
These are
Lori,
amazing.
the amazing cookies.
Look at those.
And Cami's photography. Isn't that just amazing? Just amazing. So thank you both for all the things that you've shared, including this part of your life that is very inspirational and uplifting for all of us.
Yes, we have comments in the chat. Such amazing and talented women. What resilience and beauty you send to the world. And thank you for being with us today and for sharing your stories. And for the participants, we put some links in the chat and that have resources for you. And please don't hesitate to contact Global Rights for Women or go on our website if you have follow-up you'd like to engage with us. So again, thank you, Cami and Lori. Thank you, Pat, for all your vision and organization. And
Right.
say goodbye.
Yeah.
Take care, everybody.